New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hi, I'm Leanne Whitney, guest host working alongside host Jeffrey Mishlove, co-host Emmy Vadnais, and my other colleagues here at New Thinking Aloud. Today, I'm excited to welcome Christopher Key Chapple to the show. Christopher Key Chapple is Doshi Professor of Indic in Comparative Theology and founding director of the Master of Arts and Yoga Studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, California. Chris earned his BA at Stony Brook University and an MA and PhD at Fordham University in New York City. Chris joined the faculty of LMU in 1985. He has published more than 20 books, both edited volumes as well as single author studies, including Yoga and the Luminous, Patañjali's Spiritual Path to Freedom, and Thinking with the Yoga Sutra, Translation and Interpretation. Chris serves on various advisory boards throughout the world, including the Forum of Religion and Ecology at Yale, the Jain Studies Center in London, the Dharma Academy of North America in Berkeley, and the International School for Jain Studies in Delhi. In this interview, Chris and I discuss yoga philosophy and psychology from both a broad and a more narrow and contextual perspective. Chris shares several stories from his over 5 decades of participating in the U.S. and worldwide yoga communities. Chris is joining me remotely from his office at Loyola Marymount University, and now I will switch over to the internet interview. Hi, Chris. Welcome. Nice to be with you today.
Good to see you.
Yes.
Good to be here.
Great. I look forward to sharing your insights on yoga philosophy and yoga psychology. I know you're a long-term practitioner, somewhere maybe in the 1970s. What was your first introduction to yoga?
Well, it's interesting. When the book Be Here Now came out, and it used to be tied with twine and very, very large, I saw those pictures of yoga poses in the back. So I started to do them. This would have been, 1969 or 1970. I was a teenager. And then the Kundalini people had opened a center in Rochester, New York, and they taught a class at the University of Rochester Chapel, the strong chapel right down on the Genesee River. And that was my very, very first asana class. So that was something of a beginning. But even before that, I had begun the practice of Zazen when I was 13 under the guidance as written in Philip Kaplow's groundbreaking book, 3 Pillars of Zen. And I interviewed Philip Kaplow and did a lecture to my 9th grade social studies class that I'm still giving decades and decades later.
Wow. So you were exposed really young. Were your parents involved in?
My parents were interesting people. They were, I'm not going to say categorized easily, but my father had gotten into aviation in the 1930s. My mother was a student of science and psychology and participated in the parapsychology research of J.B. Ryan at Duke University in the 1930s. So there was this sort of background of receptivity. And when I told my parents I was transferring university to take up the study and practice of meditation and yoga with a woman from India on Long Island, and I gave them, I said, how do I explain to them? But I gave them Paramahansa Yogananda's Autobiography of a Yogi. And they both read it and they said, oh, this is very interesting. And then they came down and they met Granyanjali, and it was wonderful.
Boy, that opens up a lot with your mother and her parapsychological research. I want to go back to Be Here Now real quick, though. Had you already been exposed to Ram Dass prior to picking up Be Here Now?
No, I mean, that's how he really landed on the world stage. But then later, in a couple of different ways, there were intersections. So my Tibetan and Sanskrit teacher, Christopher Starr George at Stony Brook University, had been a student at Harvard. But when they fired Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, he and his best friend Bob Thurman dropped out of Harvard and ended up studying with Geshe Wangyal in New Jersey. So indirectly, there was something of a lineage there. And then, of course, Ram Dass continued to loom and continues to loom even after his passing as an important voice and presence.
Yes, so important. All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing that background. So you've been involved for decades in various traditions. Um, for me, I would say most concise definition of yoga philosophy is the philosophy of union or the philosophy of integration. Um, what would you say, perhaps most concisely, if you
Yeah, I'm going to be
can?
contrarian. I'm going to
Okay.
say that union with what? And what we want to avoid, at least from the Patanjali yoga perspective, is the insistence on any fixed theology. And what I would hazard to say, given the definition, chitta, vritti, nirodha, the silencing of all of the behaviors and the activities and the buzz of life, the vritti, the quieting of that is yoga. So, do we join with something? I don't know, because if we're in complete stillness, where are we? In fact, we might think of it as a radical erasure of all attachments. And that sounds slightly scary, perhaps. But at the same time, for those of us who have, and every human has experienced all these ups and downs in life, for them to go into a place of becoming quiet is truly a blessing, and a blessing self-delivered. And this is the other piece of yoga that pulls on its Jain origins and its Buddhist origins, is that the doctrine, the teaching, the wisdom, the philosophy of karma says that we're in this because we're in this, that no one has put us here, no one can get us out of here except ourselves. So on the one hand, yeah, union's a nice word. However, according to Patanjali, it's about pulling back. It's not about grabbing on.
Yeah, I love. Thank you so much for that. Because really, ultimately, yoga is a philosophy, but it's also a practice. So we want to make
Right.
sure, I think you're going into the practical aspects of it, because we need the discernment as much as the underlying linkage. So we don't want to make sure that we're not having this blanket idea of unity and any kind of bypassing into this big wash before that, the differentiation, or like you're bringing forward, the silencing, before the practices are really done to
Yeah.
again, well, would you say integration? And again, this is from the philosophical perhaps outlook.
Yeah. And the integration is absolutely essential. Another difficulty with the way people language yoga is they say, oh, it's a dualism. And what you want to do is to get rid of the worldly and just become pure consciousness. Now, that sounds like running away. And my own teacher, who was born and raised in India and studied back in the 1940s, as India was really sweeping throughout, particularly the region of Calcutta. And one of the things that she would always say is that we are best served when we are 100% attached and simultaneously 100% detached. So in the going is the coming, and we have to embrace both the going forward to understand the past, as well as the going inward to allow both that sort of difficult memory propelled by past experience to not lead to that thread of expectation. If we can just allow ourselves to be fully in the present, those are moments of yoga.
Yeah, now, right? Which I think is the first word of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is
Atta,
atta. Yeah,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Now, right. Beautiful. I do think non-attachment can be a challenging term. And I find the sutras, and maybe we even want to start there with Thread Sutra. Let's go make a note for that,
Yeah.
even just the name of the text. Um, each sutra, this is why integration is almost holographic. With each sutra, the whole rest of the book also comes forward. It's sort of the implicate,
So
explicate,
beautiful.
all there, right in the text. It's pretty profound. So yes, maybe share with us sutra definition, and then lead us into this idea of attachment, not attachment. Like, because we want to be bonded to each other. We want to feel home on the earth. That's where our heart resonates. We're, in the warm mammalian, yumminess of putting our feet on the earth. So, yeah, sutra to non-attachment, and maybe in the nuances of that for us.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's two that most people have as their go-to. Yoga's Chittavritti Nirodha, the quieting of the fluctuations of the mind, and Sthira Sukham Asana. That what is asana? It's being steady and comfortable. But my favorite is Hayam, Dukkam, Anagatam. That the purpose of the whole enterprise, the whole undertaking of yoga, is to avoid, set aside, not deny, but truly, like, I don't need to do that anymore. Hayam, dukkam. Okay, dukkam, this sorrow, this difficulty, this feeling of unease of the future. So that, okay, Hayam Dukkam Anagatam, the purpose of yoga is to avoid the pain that will arise in the future. And the big footnote there, if you don't take corrective action. And the corrective action is twofold. One, pratipaksha bhavanam, to cultivate the opposite. Okay, if you're a violent person, just work on being nonviolent. Okay, that's number one. And then the number two is pratiprasava. How do we manage to take control? By tracing things back to their origin. And pratiprasava is also related to that word sutra. Like, we are threaded beings, and as we unravel all of those threads, as we untie all of those knots, we arrive at a place of understanding. That understanding begins with our place on the continuum of klishta karma, afflicted past actions. And they're said by Patañjali to be fivefold. And the Buddhists have their own list, and the Jains have their own lists, and other yoga scholars develop their particular take on this. But according to Patanjali, avidya, ignorance, asmita, egoism, it's all about me, Raga, being drawn and attracted to the shiny things. Dvesha, recoiling and stirring up hatred towards stuff you don't like. And then abhinavesha. And we're in a culture moment where most of the United States is represented by elders, people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and even some people in the Senate, I think, are even in their 90s. And what are they there for? They're holding on. They just want to continue. We can't really fault them. I mean, none of us, Freud talked about thanatos, that allure that death holds. But, most people, no, they want eros. They want more life. And to the degree that this is the human condition, that we want to live, we're drawn to things, we're repelled by things, we have an ego, we have this simmering delusion state. What do we do with that? And what yoga says is that we gird ourselves with discipline, and that we gird ourselves by inhabiting mind states of nonviolence, mind states and action committed to truth. That we be careful not to take what's not ours, that we be careful with our bodily energies, and this is particularly the most sort of American medicine that we can find, that we interrogate all the stuff that we need and compare that with the stuff that we want and acquire. So ahimsa, nonviolence; satya, holding to truth; asteya, not stealing; brahmacharya, being respectful of bodily energy; and then aparigraha, where we just let go all of the stuff that we have. And I'll just say, the process of aging, and those of you who have done your math, I'm not a youngster. And what happens as you reach a certain threshold of numbers of years lived, you begin to think, oh, well, what's going to happen to this stuff when either I retire or am no more? And you begin to say, oh, it would be a burden for others to have to let that stuff go. And that baggage is both emotional baggage as well as physical items. Then to support that process of disentangling, we're encouraged to take up practices of purification, to take up an attitude of gratitude and contentment, to adhere to, and part of my sadhana, my spiritual instruction, included and continues to include now more than 50 years of a day of Sabbath, a day of fasting, okay? So that would be a tapas. That's a discipline through
Per
which
week?
you,
Sorry.
per
Sorry, per
week,
week?
one day a
Uh-huh.
week. Yeah. So if you do the math, it's more than 7 years of not eating. Um, and that tapas, it could be silence. It could be, a whole range of things that are a little bit uncomfortable, but make you stronger. And then svadhyaya, study, like what we're doing here, having conversations about philosophical matters. And then finally, ishvara pranidhana, dedicating oneself to a higher ideal. And that ideal could be something as simple as ahimsa, as nonviolence itself. But the ideas put together in the yoga system are designed to allow that integration to take flesh. So, in other words, if you're nonviolent, you're concerned about your words and your actions. If you're being truthful, who are you being truthful with? The people around you, okay? Very much to be found within the world. And the same can be said of all of those other 8 practices.
Beautiful. Yeah, the yamas and niyamas, the first 2 limbs of Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga. And again, this idea that with each word, ahimsa, nonviolence, satya, truth, um, Brahman, I mean, it's within the Brahmanic tradition, or even if we just Purusha, pure consciousness. Again, not to focus on that, but that again, Svabhava, right? Like sitting inside itself. It's this idea that pure consciousness, Purusha, Brahman, it sits inside itself. It is the truth to itself. There is no violence to itself because there is nothing other than itself sitting inside itself. That's my clunky way to articulate that. Does that resonate, or do you see where I'm going there?
Yes, and in the Nirvana Shatakam attributed to Shankara, beautiful song that lists out all of the possible occasions for attachment to the senses, attachment to the body, attachment to emotions. And it says, I'm not any of that. I am pure consciousness. And that's an apt reminder of that simultaneous accepting and letting go.
For people who come to yoga, and maybe they've grown up in very different kinds of traditions, do they have to have a faith to even commit to the practice? Because the practices, they can be fiery, or I don't know if we want to say there's a structure to them, but there's a commitment. It's definitely it's a commitment, but day after day, year after year, the practices bear fruits. I think of yoga as it's very fruit bearing. That as you do the practices, the philosophy becomes more and more apparent as the lens is cleared. So I don't know if there's anything to say to that around like the faith piece for people who may, look at a tapas, or a sadhana like yours, like, or even Pratipaksha Bhavana that you spoke to before, this idea. And maybe you could actually talk more about that sutra, because Patanjali lists probably 4 or 5 things. If you're going in this direction, pull it back in this direction. Because the ego wants to really convince itself that the compulsion to go in that direction is to discharge that anger, to discharge that rage. There is something, the delusional aspect of the system really believes that discharge is the way to go. And of course, there is righteous anger. So there are nuances here, for sure.
Yeah, my own teacher put it this way. She said, our greatest weakness is our greatest strength. And this goes to that term, swabhava. And we talk about the swarupa of pure consciousness, but coupled with that is the swabhava of our individual karma-encrusted jiva, or life force. And when you were talking about faith, I was thinking of breath. I think most of us have seen videos of small children advising even their own parents, just breathe, just inhale and exhale, calm down. That's life-giving, but it's also, in a sense, faith-giving. It also has been well documented for more than 1,000 years that our thoughts ride upon the breath. And that as we're able to slow the breath, we're able to slow the thoughts. And as we look at the sources of human pain, people have aches and pains, and bodies age, and people get COVID and hopefully recover. That's physical pain. But what remarkably distinguishes the human is our mental agony. And we are prone, and young people in particular, because with social media, there's been this feedback loop that's unnormal, unnatural, that it allows you to compare yourself. And the comparing mind is the most violent mind. The comparing mind takes yourself and makes it an object to be lined up with other people with tragic and sometimes fatal consequences. And when we look at the Brahma Vihara, these are the four qualities of the enlightened being held in common across yoga traditions, Buddhist traditions, Jain traditions. And number three, mudita, is overcoming envy and jealousy. And quite literally, envy and jealousy kill people. And by having a breakthrough where I don't need to compare them, and we all do it all the time, I don't really need to do that. It's not helpful. And that, I think, is a medicine that our young people need, and that elders eventually they just lose interest and look in the mirror and like whatever. But that idea of just sort of keeping up and making certain and holding on, the antidote, mudita, is cultivating a sympathetic joy. To look at someone who has remarkable qualities, that has great merit, whether it be a physique or accomplishment or whatever it may be, an idea. And rather than saying, oh, just say, wow, that's great. And just with enthusiasm, and enthusiasm, okay, means seeing the God in. And by sharing joy with someone else's success, you're seeing the God that's present through your enthusiasm and your support.
I love that. It actually reminds me of a teaching on a Ram Dass recording that I heard ages ago, where Ram Dass also speaks to like maybe an alcoholic raging, or like, oh, that you're doing the best version of an alcoholic, like just seeing the God inside of the behavior instead of judging it. And again, it's not that we don't want to make ourselves safe or have appropriate boundaries. I mean, there's lots of nuances here, but that ability to always cultivate this sense of whether it be divinity or the pure consciousness or something inside every being, and not compete or denigrate sort of the outer shell or the outermost behaviors.
Yeah, there's Lojong teachings in Tibet that say, and there's I think 57 of them, and they're each a phrase. And one of them, which I really love, is don't try to figure out other people. The only person you can figure out is yourself. And the process that our teacher, Anjali, gave us was first seek understanding. And we find understanding in all different ways, the stories, the narratives that we tell ourselves about who we are. Seek understanding. And with understanding comes acceptance. And with that acceptance, peace arises. And with that peace, we find our freedom. And I remember when I was a teenager and I first met her, and we were at an apartment in Lindenhurst, New York, and she was blessing this residence. And she turned to me and she said, "We're going to go on quite a journey." And we did. And the unfolding, from my teen years, 20s, 30s, 40s, as they unfolded every decade, brought new understandings. And with that, thankfully, acceptance, as well as a feeling, not, 100% 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but I really am grateful for the leaving behind of that teenage angst and accepting, finding peace, and being free from things that really, literally could have been fatal.
Mm. Acceptance and understanding. And would you say that as you moved through your maturation process, your yoga practice, that yes, a greater understanding of self, but that also then allows a greater understanding of maybe the human mind and how it moves in general, like work with the self, and then especially as far as these compulsions to go out or the ability to be silent or remove, turn the projections around and stay within, it becomes more clear and more evident that someone's mind
Yeah,
is excessively busy and compulsive.
yeah, it's interesting. As you're speaking, I'm reminded of the arc of the Bhagavad Gita. And the Bhagavad Gita starts with a warrior called Arjuna in deep despair, counseling with his charioteer and cousin, who also happens to be divine, called Krishna. And what Krishna does is remind Arjuna of 4 different yogas: karma yoga, don't be attached; jnana yoga, know that your soul can never be killed; bhakti yoga, be devoted to your good friend, I'm right here; and then finally Raja Yoga, which is actually not called Raja Yoga there, but nonetheless there are very specific instructions on how to meditate. Not terribly useful as you're going into battle, but certainly an integration of all of those are an integration would be a good and becomes a good path to follow. And it all leads to this apotheosis, to this catharsis, to this collapse of the world as Arjuna had anticipated it to be. Utter, utter nirodha of just staggering proportions. In chapter 11, the bankruptcy chapter, he loses all of his investments. And then what does Krishna do for those remaining 8 chapters, or I should say 7 chapters, is he talks about the 3 gunas. And when we move toward both understanding and acceptance, both of self and others, to see each situation, to see each person, is an amalgam of a little bit of heaviness, a little bit of fieriness, a little bit of light illumination in varying degrees that we can accept. Yeah, I got to go to sleep at night. I'm a little bit like, I really need a nap now, and that's okay. It's part of the manifest. And as we stoke up through our asana and pranayama and even meditation practice, that fire that brings us to renewed sense of the energetic, and then sattva, being able to move lightly through the work of this lifetime, and then see, oh, well, that person, yeah, they got a lot of tamas, and I don't know the story. I may know a little bit of the story, but what I've learned, not only with myself, but as I think about my siblings, my parents, my children, my wife, that, and not to mention my friends and many, many, many students over the years, that I can only know a little bit of what is visible. And if I can see this, not from a place of that's who you are, but see this as this is a moment of a lot of rajas, a lot of fire, or this is a moment of a little bit of heaviness, tamas, or this is a moment we can celebrate, a moment of pure being, of sattva. That's a gift, but we can't hold on to any of it.
This constant moving of the contents of consciousness. So there's the seer and the seen, we could say, and cultivating that awareness of the pure witness in relationship to, perhaps we could say, the contents, the ever moving dance of the contents of consciousness. Um, and yeah, that goes to the acceptance, the non-judgment. Um, what would you say about intention or uh, activism? Because there is a sense of social justice in a way in the Bhagavad Gita. I mean, Arjuna, he's between a rock and a hard place. It's like his relatives, it's a war on his relatives, or else his relatives take over land that's due to his family. So there is a social justice piece, even in the
And
telling
that
of that
speaks
story.
to, yeah, it's been a very, very moving past couple of weeks. Mahatma Gandhi took the Gita to heart. He studied asana and pranayama with Swami Kuvalyananda, who was the great science researcher of the 1920s. It's the 100th anniversary of the establishment of Kaivalyadham, where Gandhi received yoga training. And in the 1930s, Gandhi also took direct initiation from Paramahamsa Yogananda, who was visiting India. And at the core of Gandhi's success is his commitment to nonviolence. And it was, talk about integration, it was an integrated reflection on his part. He had influences from his birth religion of Jainism, from his childhood and ongoing encounters with various aspects, Vaishnavism, Jainism, Hinduism, all of it sort of in South Africa became sort of informed by Tolstoy and by Tolstoy's desire to cherish life. And then he translated it into political action. We know the horrifying consequences of slavery and casteism. We know the horrifying consequences of misogyny. We know the horrifying consequences of colonialism, and we live in the residues of these tragedies. And as I said, the past couple of weeks, all of this has come to the front. James Lawson was a young kid in outside Cleveland. And when he was 4 or 5 years old, was black, and some other playmate referred to him with the N-word, and he hit him. And he went back to his mother and said, I showed that kid. And his mother said, now, James, what did hitting that other child accomplish? And it set him on a trajectory. It set him on a lifelong commitment to nonviolence that brought him to jail. And we're hearing about reviving the draft, okay, in this country, but perhaps certainly in other nations, in Israel and Ukraine and the Soviet Union, places of war. And what he refused was the call to service that would have sent him to participate in the Korean War. And because he refused service of war, he was thrown in jail for nearly 2 years. And when he came out, his resolve further deepened. And he traveled to India, to a town called Sevagram. And he became a school teacher and a coach. And he studied with the Gandhians. And Sevagram, the ashram that Gandhi had founded, this is shortly after Gandhi's assassination, still continues to teach and to invite people to learn about nonviolence. But Vinoba Bhave, the great successor to Gandhi, the great land reformer who helped India undo the old feudal method of everybody, like the peasants in Tolstoy's Russia, everybody gives their money to the landlord, and we have these Rajas and Ranis, these kings and queens that don't do much of anything, but they just collect a lot of rent. What he did was imbibe. How can we do what Gandhi did for the people of America, the people who have essentially no civil rights? And he came back after his service at the end of the 1950s and started studying at Oberlin College to become a minister. And Martin Luther King Jr. came up to Oberlin in Ohio and said, "James, we need you in Nashville." And he moved to Nashville and started, and he continued up until last month to hold trainings on the practice of nonviolence as a tool for social uplift. And sure enough, Martin Luther King Jr. learned those techniques. Rosa Parks learned those techniques. John Lewis learned those techniques. And you can see this in the movie Selma. You can see those workshops that I've participated in decades later, taught by Reverend Lawson, who just passed a few weeks ago. And we had the most remarkable celebration of his life this past weekend with just stellar reminders of how one person can truly make a difference. So yes, the movement, so-called, continues, and it's taken up by different people in different ways for different causes. But at ground, it's about the sanctity of life.
Mm, mm. Beyond the polarities, taking that
Exactly.
taking the comfortable seat in the body to do your dharma or live your truth or live in alignment. Again, that's the sort of yamas and niyamas working together. You can articulate that, I think, in all ways. But it really is beyond the dualities in incredibly polarizing times. Now, again, Patanjali is teaching the involution of all thought form, Nirodha, the stilling, right? The pratiprasava. So, in pure consciousness can sit inside its true nature, shall we say, or chit shakti, which I'd love for you to speak to a
Yeah,
little
the
bit
very
too.
last phrase of the Yoga Sutra. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's the challenge, is when the polarities are so alive and so strong, red, blue, right, left, trying to pull the mind. It's the third thing, maybe what Carl Jung would call the transcendent function, um, but the stilling. So I don't know if you would call it the third thing in yoga, but certainly so the stillness can happen and the pure consciousness can sit inside itself, and then it's aklis, or it's thought forms without the colorings, like the thought forms that are in alignment with the yamas or truth.
Yeah. I remember the very first time I read the translation of the Yoga Sutra by Swami Prabhavananda and Christopher Isherwood. And Christopher Isherwood had come in the 1940s, actually in the 1930s, out of Berlin, which was quickly being overpowered by the Nazis, landed in Hollywood, and became a very important figure within the Vedanta Society of Hollywood, working with Swami Prabhavananda to do what became very popular renditions of the Bhagavad Gita and the Yoga Sutra. He's just such an elegant writer. And if you've not watched Cabaret recently with Liza Minnelli, go back and watch it, because all of those words are Christopher Isherwood's words, reflecting on the courage required in order to find freedom, right? And by becoming part of the Vedanta Society, he found his voice, and he more or less single-handedly empowered through his honesty, his radical honesty, empowered the voices that became the gay liberation movement to speak. And I remember when he confessed to his Swami that, oh, but I have these impulses. And the Swami said, he just sort of smiled and said, well, if everybody's God, then everybody's God. And I'm, to unpack, gender history and sexual identity history throughout the course of Indian culture in America, and it's just too much to even consider. But what struck me about this particular translation of the Yoga Sutra, not without its flaws, was the emotion that welled up in me when I read that final sutra about chit shakti. And what happens in this gradual crescendo is that the klishta karmas, the afflicted narratives of past action through meditation dissolve. And you're left with having done everything that needs to be done. And I remember I used to try to make excuses because I, as a yoga student in my teens and 20s, I would do stupid things. And then I would try to say to my guru, Guru Ma, I'd say, well, I'm older. And she said, it doesn't matter how old you are physically, you need to grow up, right? And by that, by growing up, what she meant was, no, there's no age placed upon wisdom. And Shankaracharya had renounced the world at the age of 7 and had traveled the whole subcontinent, written voluminously before he died at the age of 32, right? And just a shining beacon of what is possible, really, at any age. And this culminating phrase, chit shakti, leaves us with the challenge of, okay, you've had an insight, you've had an epiphany. What do you do? Okay, how do you allow that freedom to continue to inform your ongoing life? What shakti, what power can you bring to chit, to that awareness? And until that moment of the last breath, we have another breath. We have a life. We have, by virtue of our simple physical presence, an ongoing stake, an ongoing contribution to make to life itself. So, as we look at the Brahma-vihara that I mentioned earlier, to develop Maitri, to develop this friendliness, this loving heart. And in yoga, it says, just expend that energy on people that are really okay, on people who are worthy of your friendship. Okay. And I think all of us have gone through that path of, really trying to help a friend, but surround yourself with good company. Second, for those who suffer, do what you can. And I've been involved with my students for many years now with advocacy for housing for the unhoused. Okay, and that would be out of a duty, a sense of karuna. Then mudita, which I talked about earlier, is, get over the envy, get over the jealousy, put down your phone if you need to. And, I was just so, and for me, it happened with all sorts of physical releases. And I think many people have talked about, I was just crying in yoga class and something happened to me. And that experience, not that long ago, really freed me to not only understand, but to be able to celebrate the goodness of others. And then upeksha, to have that equanimity. And during difficult political times, to have the forbearance to see that people with firmly held views, they're people. And what can we do that does not pit ourselves against other people? And full confession, I was simultaneously drawn, because of commitment to nonviolence as a teenager, to the Religious Society of Friends, established by George Fox in the 1600s as a pioneering nonviolent movement within Christian faith, and have labored on behalf of political candidates who are somewhat adjacent to that mindset. And of course, anyone in the political realm is tainted by money, tainted by influence from all sides. And yet we need to do quiet discernment of what is reasonable, what is, and democracy itself, if we look not at the English version, but at the French version: liberty, equality, siblinghood, okay? That those values place us in relationship with one another. And we need to find that connection point. When you said yoga is union, well, I want to join through understanding with everybody, looking for their best self. And regardless of how it may come down into red or blue, there's something of sincere desire that manifests people, and something of sincere desire that allowed George Fox's commitment to nonviolence to be taken up by so many people, including Martin Luther King Jr., in a way that says, don't go up against, just present your truth. And be willing to take the insults. Be willing to allow people to assail you and pillory you. And we have to, we shall overcome. And again, that sounds a little bit less than friendly, but nonetheless, we shall persevere.
Beautiful. I mean, that perseverance, that ability to take the blows that come, the insults. Again, that shakti. That's the power, the empowerment. Maybe we could use the term empowerment, and the understanding of the interdependence of all phenomena. So again, we don't want to just sort of have this wash of a unity, but it is like interdependent, interconnected phenomena. And the empowerment to stay perhaps in the neutral axis beyond the polarities, but advocating towards the yogic liberation of all beings, or the karuna, just the compassion towards suffering, or just another step towards I don't want to say ending suffering, but ending suffering. What one could do just to take a step to lessen the sufferings.
Yeah, and to put ourselves in the company of those who share that commitment. And we've been blessed here. We have a program called the Doshi Bridge Builder Award, which I administer. And we've given almost 20 of these so far in the last almost 20 years. And it's put us in the company of Desmond Tutu. It's put us in the presence of Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh. And I remember when he agreed to come, and I was so thrilled. And then the phone call came. Oh, and by the way, I'm accompanied with 100 monks and nuns. You need to arrange for them to be on the stage with me, and you have to feed us all. Okay. And it was, we filled the gym. It was just such a remarkable moment. And my wife and I were worried because we were at the head table. We had to eat lunch with Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh. And we said, well, what do you say? And the answer was, you keep silent at lunch, right? So that was, we sort of off the hook, but we were really feeling blessed by that presence. And for months and months and months, people came up and thanked me because the peace that he literally stood for permeated the atmosphere of the campus. And those who still remain from all those years ago and remember that day, they just light up when they reflect.
I bet. I bet. Incredible teacher. And we've been incredibly blessed in our lifetime to have amazing teachers incarnate, for sure. Well, thank you so much for sharing your stories and all your wisdom. Any last thoughts that you would like to leave any of our listeners with about this moment in time? And we've touched upon really important things like acceptance, understanding, the self-study, picking just one part of the path that yoga can point to. Self-study, sitting in the fire of purification. Anything else that you feel like is really important or rich to share?
Yeah, I think humility, because we can only do what we can do. And to assume greatness is warned of in the Yoga Sutra. And it says that if other people flatter you, don't buy into it. And my teacher wrote this beautiful song, and I'll just sing one phrase from it. It's a little bit like a sutra. I am doing what I can. Are you doing what you can? I am doing what I can. Are you doing what you can? And I reflect on those words every day because what am I? I'm just a teacher and a writer. And, I feel quite blessed, but it's a small world. However, every world is a small world. And what we can do within our small world, within ourselves, within our family, within our work, collectively, that can raise the vibration. So I love your invocation of chit shakti and relating it to chittavritti nirodha and relating it to, again, mutual uplift, what Gandhi called sarvodaya, the bringing up, udaya, sarva, of everything. And that's the gift of yoga. So thank you. This has been really lovely.
Oh my God. Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much for sharing your time and all your wisdom. And thank you for those of you watching and listening. Thank you for being with us. You are the reason that we're here in community, exploring our common unity.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a PDF copy or order a beautiful printed copy of issue 6 of the new Thinking Aloud magazine.
Hi, it's Leanne Whitney, guest host at New Thinking Aloud. You are warmly invited to visit transformationandintegration.com to access additional resources that support the journey through deep transformation, and to learn more about the ongoing offerings at Center for Transformation and Integration, including our certified training in transformational coaching with an emphasis in somatic integration therapy. I look forward to welcoming you there.